All right, so hi everyone. Thanks for joining for our first episode in Crypto Chronicles, brought to you by Lifestone Insights. We try to create a different series that explores Bitcoin, all the cryptocurrencies out there to help you better understand them and also better understand their movements in order for you to make educated decisions. So today we have two of my closest friends who are analysts at LSI. We have Marco and Arthur. And I guess we can start by introducing ourselves. Maybe you can tell us where are you currently in the world and a little bit about yourselves. So Marco, do you want to go first?
Sure, Bogdan. So, hi, my name is Marco Tarshun. I'm currently in quarantine in Hong Kong. So, in the hotel quarantine, it's been going okay. I'm a first-year Master of Finance student, Schema Business School in Paris, which is why I'm in quarantine, because I was in Paris beforehand and arriving back in Hong Kong. I'm also an analyst for the Crypto Chronicles, but also for the Politics Review for LSI.
Hey guys, I'm Arthur Herbert. So I go to Bath Uni, second year economics student. And what really got me into cryptocurrencies, apart from obviously the high returns, is definitely how new the space is. For me, I'd sort of say it's kind of what's really interesting for me is how when the stock exchange sort of went electronic, I'd say the era we're in right now, with the birth of cryptocurrencies, it's so new and exciting. I just couldn't not get involved.
Sounds good. So pretty much the purpose of our first episode is to explore the relationship between blockchain and Bitcoin, and we entitled it as a love story. So right now, I just want to ask you also, Marco, just because I think Arthur already touched on it. What got you in crypto?
Oh, that's a good question. So the first time I actually heard about cryptocurrencies was actually in 2017. Just before the classic 17K crash. And one of my friends was really interested about it. He's like, hey, Marco, like, dude, it's super interesting. You should have a look. He explained to me blockchain, the technology behind it. I was like, yeah, it's quite good. But, at that time, I wasn't really into like all the finance stuff because I was, before doing my finance degree, I was actually studying political science and international relations. So very, very different from, the world of cryptocurrencies, etc. So despite having some understanding of it, I was like, you know what, it's interesting, but it's not really like my cup of tea. So, maybe I'll do that later. And that actually happened 2 years later. For some really weird reason, I started looking at lots of videos about it, started doing my own research. And then last year, and exactly a year ago, I bought a bit of Bitcoin after the crash. That's where you were able to actually buy a one Bitcoin for almost $3,000, which was a really good deal. And obviously, since then, the rest is history, right?
No, 100%. I guess like for me, Bitcoin and all the cryptocurrencies was like a foreign discipline, just because I'm more of a value investor. I know more about equities and investments in that sort of sense. So that's why I guess it's great to learn a little bit more about crypto, just because everyone has taken notice of it, like from all the banks to like the retail traders. So Marco, Arthur, sorry, do you want to add anything on that, or can I explain?
Do you mind just saying that question again? Sorry, my Wi-Fi just cut out.
Yeah, for sure. So what got you into crypto?
So as I was saying earlier, the returns. So I started trading just less than a year ago, and that was after my internship with Amplify. And I was super interested in equities, but I just wasn't really like making high enough returns for what I really wanted to do. And that's when a mate told me about cryptocurrencies. I guess you could say it all sort of started with ADA, which is the Cardano project, which I'm sure is something we'll definitely get onto later on in the series. But that's where it all started. And as I started to learn more and more about this technology, especially blockchain and how it's implemented and stuff, I thought how interesting this whole space was and how new it was. And considering how our sort of world as we know it is moving to the digital, everything's being accelerated to become digitalized. I just wanted to get involved, and especially with cryptocurrencies.
Sounds good. Well, I guess right now we cannot ignore them, so I guess everyone wants to get into them. Therefore, it's important to be educated in that sort of sense. So today we're just going to talk about money, the history of money, and of course, blockchain, Bitcoin, and pretty much we're going to have some closing remarks and tell you a little bit about what we plan to cover in the next episodes. So if Bitcoin is money, then I guess it's advisable to ask, what is money? And I guess like any one of you can take that, guys.
So this is a really good question. And basically money, the characteristics of money are three things. One of them is the medium of exchange, the other is the store of value, and the last thing is the unit of account. Obviously, none of the money are able to actually represent all the three dimensions, and they all present different trade-offs. For the medium of exchange parts, what is actually very important is that it's how easy it is for a currency to be exchanged for products and services. And the medium of exchange has also its characteristics. The first one being durability, which is basically saying how easily it is replaceable if it's damaged, and also how long it can actually last. The second one is being transportability. Makes sense. How can you transport that money from one location to the other? Third one is just divisibility. How you can actually divide it into different smaller values. Fungibility is the fourth one, about how it can, accept how the value is undistinguishable from one another. And the last one is how the non-counterfeitability of it. And so how it is, how the actual money that you have, how hard it is to actually create a fake money, and how you can actually separate it. If you're able to actually create that fake money, what are the differentiation between the fake and the real ones? And so you can actually see those characteristics in the medium of exchange. And those characteristics of the medium of exchange by itself can be all relatable to Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies.
And there's also something else. So with money in general, another determining factor of money is its unit of account. So in short, it is the standard monetary unit of measurement of values for goods and services. But I guess you could say in plain English that prices are quoted in terms of money rather than other goods. So if I were to go to the pub and buy a pint, I wouldn't give the barman, potatoes and stuff. I'd actually have something to give him. So in general, we'd say a good unit of account is stable and doesn't suffer from the effects of inflation, which tends to destroy the basic stability of money. And a final factor for money is definitely its store of value, which quite literally means what it says on the tin. So a store of value is essentially a mechanism by which wealth can be saved and retrieved in the future. But the key thing here is with some predictability about its future value. So look at gold, for example. We would regard gold as the ultimate safe haven asset, since its store of value doesn't deteriorate in an economic crisis, and it's always in demand and it's easily convertible. And arguably, some cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin are starting to be considered as a store of value with similar characteristics to gold, but with extra stuff as well.
Oh, for sure. Thanks for that. This reminds me actually of a movie that I saw, highly recommend to anyone. I think it's on Netflix as well, The Laundromat. That starts with the history of money as well, like whenever people were doing like exchanges with different products and stuff like that. But I was wondering, guys, why are cryptocurrencies important in the history of money in general?
And that is actually a very good question. And to really understand, the cryptocurrencies within the history of money, we need to actually have a good understanding of, of the history of money by itself. And so, how did individuals were able to actually use any good or anything that they actually received to be able to use it as an exchange, but to exchange to other people through commerce and trade. And so the first thing that actually happened was through barter. So bartering is basically the concept where you use something. I would say like something such as a shell, a cattle, teas, grain, and tobacco. And that was kind of considered the historical primitive money. And so they use this and get it and exchange a shell with a cattle, teeth was a grain, a tobacco was something else. And despite this actually being okay during those primitive periods, it did bring up one of the biggest problems, which is the double coincidence of want. So the double coincidence of want is where, for example, is the value of a shell compared to a grain going to be later on in a later exchange? For example, if you're someone that's actually using a shell to exchange the cattle, and how are you going to be able to receive the same value from a seller, from a buyer trying to buy the exact same thing that you were able to receive from the bartering? And so that creates a process that is very confusing, such as what I'm explaining right now, and basically, destroying the actual value itself. And so that created they should be behind the double coins once. Therefore, later on, humans had to through different kind of technology, they were able to form the first coinage. And the first coinage was invented in China in 1200 BC with what we call metal carries Banlian coins. Despite having some sort of success behind it, it was a bit difficult because you had the issue of debasement. And debasement is something very important that will be coming back over and over again during all our conversation, because it's probably the most important thing about basically the value and why money suffers the lack of value later on in life. And so debasement is basically the reduction in quantity of valuable metals and coins in that instance. And because of commodity metals, because of value of different commodity metals, they had to debase the money with metals that were less valuable than the original metal. And so, for example, you had a metal in gold, a coin in gold, but because gold was very hard to produce, they had to later on use silver. And so silver and gold coin didn't have the same value. And so they were always debasing and decreasing the actual value of the coin. And so that goes back to something very important called the Gresham's law, where bad money drives out good money. And as I said, it's basically people trying to hold good money and spend the bad money until there's no good money in the actual system. After that, we had what we call paper currency, which also came in China in the 10th century. This allowed people with receipts of deposits of coin currency, allowing people to deposit their coin at government authorized deposit shops and use those receipts or paper money to trade easily. And that created the first concept of the monopoly of creating money, and then later on leading to national currencies. Then if you fast forward, different years later, we go to the end of World War II with the Bretton Woods system, where they basically had a quasi-gold system where the US dollar was pegged for gold at $25 per ounce. That would create basically a system where most economies would basically regulate the financial flow, the currency, etc., with a fixed exchange rate pegged directly with the US dollars, and basically pegged with the gold system. And that created a very, I would say, stable system. Unfortunately, and that will be very important later on, that actually, they basically unpegged it in 1971 under Richard Nixon because of the Cold War, and especially because of the Vietnam War. And that allowed the US dollar to basically print money, resign the restraints, with the sole value of the money of the US dollar being on the belief of the people buying the currency. And that is very, very important. And so coming back to the debasement of the currency, that led to the hyperinflation, which we all kind of know about. And the hyperinflation is basically, having a money supply that is basically uncontrollable through overprinting and to meet their obligations. And so one of the best examples is the hyperinflation in Weimar Germany in 1923, because of Germany having to pay the reparations of World War I after Versailles Treaty by printing the marks to be able to buy the foreign currency, because basically their own currency then lack the trust and have the actual value. That totally destroyed the mark, made it totally untradable. And because of that, increase of prices, increase of wages, and just destroy the actual stability of goods and services. Obviously, there's all other examples of it. You have post-war Hungary, Mugabe, Zimbabwe, and recently we have Venezuela. And all of this, the concept of the debasement of money led to cryptocurrencies. And so why are cryptocurrencies very important is because they create this kind of inflation avoidance. They fight against the lack of intrinsic value in a currency. They have lower fees, they facilitate trade, they have the mutual exchange of credit, and they, what I would call, have the digital kind of thing, which is very popular with people these days. And so the last point I want to talk is obviously the difference between money and currency. I kind of use it interchangeably, but they actually have a big difference. And the difference between money and currency is that money is the actual value that is traded for goods and services, where currency is the paper money or coin that carries the day-to-day payment. Therefore, currency cannot be a store value, except the USD these days. But that's because the USD is the currency that is basically represents the security in the world, and therefore people considering that. But if people lose the trust in it, then it loses its value, and therefore currency does not have intrinsic value and can only be serve as a medium exchange.
This is quite interesting, Marco, just because right now I guess everyone fears inflation with the yields of the bonds rising and stuff like that. But I guess like it's important to understand that like the US dollar was pegged to the dollar, which was ages ago, and now that's being like a free floating currency has its advantages and disadvantages. But I guess you mentioned there are cryptocurrencies, and I guess the most popular one by far is Bitcoin. And I was wondering, like, what is Bitcoin? And like, if you could give us like an introduction of this asset class.
Yeah, sure thing. So Bitcoin, I'll start this from the very beginning. So apologies to people who clearly know what Bitcoin is. But for the listeners who don't, Bitcoin is a decentralized digital currency, aka known as a cryptocurrency. And the idea behind Bitcoin was introduced in the world on the 31st of October in 2008. And it was actually at the depth of the financial crisis by an unknown person or group of people using the name Satoshi Nakamoto. So yeah, the idea was to be a digital currency. And by this, we mean without the need for central banks or a single administrator. And that's what we mean from the decentralized part. So that means no single entity maintains control of Bitcoin. And in its most primal form, like we mentioned earlier, it's a store of value, like money, which can be used to buy goods and services as a way to pay people. But the key difference between Bitcoin and money is that Bitcoin supply is fixed, where money is essentially infinite. And of course, this is similar to what Marco said, with central banks printing money as much as they want. But we would think of Bitcoin more as the likes of a digital gold. And Bitcoins are essentially created as a reward in a process known as mining. And mining is a reward for maintaining the running of the Bitcoin network. And this is a very complicated process, but in more simple terms, what it's essentially doing is combining random transactions from around the world into a block and adding it to the Bitcoin blockchain. Now, rest assured, we will explain what this all means later on for the blockchain bit, but just bear this in mind. So we can think of miners as getting paid as their work as being auditors. They're essentially doing the work of verifying the legitimacy of Bitcoin transactions. And this convention is meant to keep Bitcoin users honest and was supposedly conceived by the Bitcoin's founder, Satoshi. And by verifying transactions, miners are helping prevent the double spending problem. By this, I mean, if I had a £20 note and I went to the shop and I also had a fake note and I were to go and buy something, it'd be quite, maybe not obvious, but it'd be possible to determine that I had a counterfeit due to the serial numbers being the same. But with Bitcoins, if someone was able to send a Bitcoin but keep a copy to themselves, that's a lot harder to find out. So this is what the Bitcoin was sort of made for in that sense. And although it sounds simple, it requires loads of computer power to process the millions of equations in order to earn the Bitcoins. And this subsequently consumes loads of power and requires loads of expensive technology. And another thing is, it's important to note that when verifying transactions as a miner, you're not actually entitled to receive Bitcoins, but you're more eligible. So yeah, that means, I'm sorry to crush your dream of becoming a Bitcoin miner, but if you do want to mine Bitcoin, you may actually get nothing for it. And that's simply because the rewards are distributed using a lottery-based system. So with regards to mining, what happens is that every 4 years, the reward for mining halves. And we call this process as halving. This helps to increase the scarcity of Bitcoin, which you could argue have helped Bitcoin reach its high monetary value. So just for an example, back in 2009, if you're a miner and you mined a block, so you combine those transactions using your computers, created a block, added it to the chain, you would get 50 Bitcoins as a reward. But now, or last year in 2020, this is only now 6.25. And every year it will halve all the way up until the year 2140, which is when the last Bitcoin will ever be mined. So as we keep on mentioning, it's a good way to think of Bitcoin is like a digital gold because of this sort of limited supply. So the first use of the currency was all the way back in 2009, when its implementation was released as an open source software. And this is where 30,000 lines of code essentially marked the beginning of Bitcoin. And it was where the first Genesis block was mined, which we will again explain later within blockchains. But this is something that I find personally really interesting. And it's that hidden within this first block, the Genesis block's code, was actually a message leading to a 2009 Times article headlined "Chancellor on Brink of a Second Bailout for Banks." So obviously this was after the financial crisis, and we have the biggest cryptocurrency known today created around then, with all the fear of banks and bailouts. And the fact that we don't know who Satoshi is, it's super, some people would say sort of conspiracy theories there, but it's an interesting thing. But that line people say was added supposedly as a real world timestamp to mark Bitcoin's beginning, because it's a newspaper article. It couldn't have been produced after. But people say it's also a cool for accountability and transparency. And Bitcoin was created on capitalist principles with incentives, built-in incentives to reflect them. So you have to mine to get the Bitcoin, and it's neither anti-bank nor anti-government, but almost exists, I guess you could say, sort of as a global ledger of truth. And that's because everything is so transparent. Interesting one here. So when Bitcoin was first made, it was about a year, I think about a year after it's first created, the first ever transaction took place. And this was when a Florida man negotiated to have 2 Papa John's pizzas valued at $25. And he paid 10,000 Bitcoins for this. And this led us to our first ever valuing of a Bitcoin at 0.25 cents. So if we fast forward today, that same transaction would have had a value of 114 million. But in the early days, the first transactions were actually negotiated on internet forums, with people literally bartering for goods and services in exchange for Bitcoins. So sort of linking back to the early days of money, sort of bartering. Well, when Bitcoin was first made, it was originally you would barter. So yeah, then we had other networks starting to be built on the Bitcoin chain. So miners and coders started to build the likes of Ethereum and Litecoin, which is all stuff we'll get onto in other episodes. But, just coming from that initial creation, Bitcoin is now at about 42,000 pounds a coin. It doesn't really show any signs of slowing down. And with mainstream attention from, hedge funds to Elon, it's come a considerable way. And it's definitely apparent that the crypto market has matured. But one last final thing for the history of Bitcoin. So Satoshi Nakamoto actually withdrew from public in 2011. And he said he wanted he'd finished with this project and was moving on to other things. And he left it for the community to develop. But the anonymousness of Satoshi has left the world asking the question, who is he? Why has he created Bitcoin? Was he a group of people? Some people say he was Japanese. Other people say he was English. But regardless to say, we don't actually know who he is. But the one thing we do know is he has around 1 million Bitcoins with an estimated value of 42 billion. So yeah, he's not exactly done bad for himself.
And so for the next concept that will be explaining about Bitcoin, and that's more of a personal thing that I wanted to actually talk about, is the Byzantine generalist problems. I think it's a concept that is a bit difficult to explain, but it's basically the goal of Satoshi in creating the actual blockchain behind Bitcoin. And so why is the Byzantine generalist problem? It's basically the problem is a problem of trying to agree on a course of action of the state of the system by exchanging information over an unreliable and potential compromised network. So basically, in the context of Bitcoin, is trying to build a distributed and trusted system with no central control to enforce trust, especially when the distributed segments need to communicate with each other but the failure of in the communication is very, very high. And so therefore, to be able to solve that problem, which Arthur actually talked about, you have to go through the process of proof of work via the mining process. Why the name Byzantine General's problems? And so basically, the name is related to the sieging of a city and how the communication to take the city has to be, and how efficient you need to basically do the communication. And it is a problem because obviously within communication and the messages and etc., you have a risk of traitors and enemies intercepting the message, and basically understanding how you're going to be able to do it, and the whole process of the strategic plan. We might go into another episode about explaining even more the Byzantine General's problem, but it's something that I find very, very fascinating. The next thing is basically the monetary policies behind Bitcoin. And so the monetary policy is basically available for everyone to examine and verify through the process of the protocol based on the open source code. It is driven through a consensus of set rules which are agreed by users, either by people that started the Bitcoin or even the people that actually buying Bitcoin right now. And so the Bitcoin protocol has at a rate at where the Bitcoin is created every 4 years, which limits the number of Bitcoin under 21 million coins. For me personally, from what the research I've actually done, there are no 21 million Bitcoin, but more between 18 to 20 million. The reason behind this is because a lot of Bitcoin are lost in transactions because people are sending money to the wrong address, etc. They have a lack of knowledge, and so they actually struggle with doing this process. The other issue is more about the money stored in keys, and so either in an online key or in a more of a physical key, you have a password, and when you forget your password, then you forget about all the money in there, and you not be able to get out of that and get hold of that, and so that creates a whole difficulty. You also have the issue where if someone, for example, passed away in your family that hold cryptocurrencies, he is the sole person that actually has know the password, and so lots of those cryptocurrencies or a Bitcoin are actually lost, and therefore they will never be able to be retrieved. As Arthur said, the Bitcoin will stop its issuance by 2040. And what's really interesting about the Bitcoin is that Bitcoin diminishing rate of issuance over the long term lets Bitcoin become a deflationary currency, which is something pretty impressive considering the other currencies that we have in the world. And so therefore it cannot be inflated through printing money, and nothing can be done after the expected issuance rate.
Yes, this is quite interesting just because it seems like a lot of people are talking about Bitcoin as being gold 2.0, like as a reserve currency. But I guess because we discussed about the history of Bitcoin, how it was created, how many Bitcoins can you mine at one time, stuff like that. I was wondering, what exactly is blockchain? Just because everyone is talking about it. You have blockchain in payment services, you have blockchain in everything. So it's quite like a buzzword, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, no, totally. And the thing that we need to understand about blockchain is that we've had in the past some attempts to create something similar to blockchain. And the first thing that was actually kind of research, and it is obvious and is actually the technology based on blockchain, is what we call cryptography. So in the late 1980s, we had a lot of researchers that were using technology to build what they call digital currencies, issuing digital money and backed by their national currency or precious metals, such as gold. However, because they're centralized and easily attacked by government or hackers, those projects basically disappeared. And this is the reason why not a lot of people before 2009 knew about those concepts, because they basically got destroyed. So those projects didn't come to date. And so the actual goal behind blockchain is to kind of allow digital information to be recorded and distributed, but not edited. And so the first time that we started having some sort of blockchain technology after cryptography that actually started having some sort of effect was in 1991 through two individuals, one being Stuart Harber and the other one called Scott Stornata. these two researchers wanted to implement a system where documents timestamp could not be tampered with. But it wasn't until the actual 2 decades later, with the launch of Bitcoin in January 2009, that the actual blockchain was put into work and have the success that we have nowadays with the different blockchains that we have, and obviously Bitcoin being number one.
So yeah, after so we got the history of blockchain, but I'm going to explain to you how it actually works. So as mentioned by Marco, blockchains are a fairly recent technology, and they've only come into mainstream more recently in the past decade, following the creation of Bitcoin. But they do form the bedrock for most cryptocurrencies. So what exactly is blockchain? Well, like the name indicates, a blockchain is a chain of blocks that contains information, and it is a type of distributed ledger that is completely open to anyone. So the main property of a blockchain, which we have seen its use saw, is essentially that once data has been recorded inside a blockchain, it becomes very difficult to change it. So let's have a look at the individual blocks within a chain. So the key thing here is that each block contains some data, which we'll get onto, the hash of a block and the hash of a previous block. So all the data that is stored inside a block depends on the type of blockchain. So for example, with Bitcoin, the blockchain stores the details about the transaction in here, such as the sender, receiver, and amount of coins. Obviously, with different blockchains, you can have different information and how it works, but as we're starting out with Bitcoin, we'll just talk about that for now. So I mentioned that blocks also contain a hash. And I guess the easiest way to think of this is that we can compare a hash as the likes to a digital fingerprint. So it's unique, and it identifies the block and classifies all of its contents. In reality, what hash actually is, it's something we call a hex, and it's 64 digits long. It's a string of numbers and letters, but it's easier to think of it as a fingerprint. So yeah, the key point is that they're unique. So once a block is created and it has its information in, it has a hash that's calculated. And if you change something inside the block, you essentially cause the hash of that block to change. So, in other words, hashes are really useful when you want to detect changes to the block. So if the fingerprint of a block changes, it no longer is the same block. So that's something that you need to know. If one tiny bit of information changes, then it has a different fingerprint and it's a different block. So the third element that I mentioned was that each block contains the hash of the previous block, which is essentially how the word blockchain was formed, because that block has to form to the block behind it and so forth. And this is why blockchains are, generally speaking, so secure. But look, let's analyze an example. So as seen in the picture, we have a chain of 3 blocks, and each block has a hash and the hash of the previous block. So block number 3 points to block number 2, and number 2 points to number 1. And as I mentioned earlier with Bitcoin, I'm sure you guys remember about the 2009 Times article. So I was saying this was called the Genesis block. So the Genesis block is the first block in the chain. That's why it's so special. It's the root of the cryptocurrency. It's where it all started, and it can't join to one behind it. So let's imagine that a hacker wants to tamper with the second block in our chain and change some of the information. So if they were successful, the hash of the second block changes. Remember what we said, if you change the hash, the fingerprint changes. So if we were to change information, block 3 and all the following blocks become invalid, as they no longer store a valid hash of the previous block. So changing a single block will make all the following blocks invalid. But as you guys are well know, that computers nowadays, they're super powerful and super fast, and they could potentially calculate super quickly all of the hashes of those previous blocks and tamper and make it seem as the chain is valid, when in fact it isn't. And they could do that by recalculating all those hashes. So to mitigate this is what blockchains have. It's a defense, so to speak, called proof of work. Now, proof of work is essentially a mechanism that just slows down the creation of new blocks. So in Bitcoin's case, it takes about 10 minutes to calculate the required proof of work and add a new block to the chain. And as I said, this means that if a computer were to try and, or a person to try and change all the hashes, it would take 10 minutes to change each hash of that block. So it makes it hard to tamper with because you need to do the proof of work for all the following blocks. And this is how some of the security of a blockchain comes from, which is its creative use of hashing and the proof of work mechanism. But if you thought this was secure enough, then think again, because blockchains have another final trick up their sleeve. And this is the way they're distributed. So instead of using a central entity to manage the chain, blockchains use a peer-to-peer network, and anyone is allowed to join. And by peer-to-peer, all we mean is that there isn't a middleman. And think of the middleman in this context as central banks, governments, or single entities. So when someone joins this network, they get a full copy of the blockchain, and the node can use this to verify that everything is still in order. So let's see what happens when someone creates a new block. So that new block is sent to everyone on the network. Each node then verifies the block. So it sends out to everyone. Every single person checks that that block is correct and make sure it hasn't been tampered with. So then if everything checks out, each node, and by node we mean like computer, adds this to their own blockchain. So all the nodes in the network would create consensus. So they basically agree about what blocks are valid and which aren't. So if our hacker tampers with a block, his version of the tampered blockchain will be rejected by all the other nodes in the network, meaning that in order to successfully tamper with a decentralized blockchain like Bitcoin, you would have to tamper with all the blocks on the chain, redo all the proof of work for each block, and then take control of more than 50% of the peer-to-peer network. So yeah, it's pretty easy, right? But now, only then would your block become accepted. But it's literally almost impossible to do. And now you guys know how blockchains work and why they are so integral for cryptocurrency security.
So now that we talked a little bit about blockchain, and definitely it was a lot to take in, I was wondering what would be the main properties of blockchain, especially in the context of Bitcoin?
So the first thing that we need to know about blockchain is decentralization. And that is probably one of the most important things, personally, about that makes blockchain and then cryptocurrencies very, very attractive. So the idea behind decentralization is, in blockchain, is like a database where in Bitcoin, it needs a collection of computers to store its blockchain. So you have a big difference between blockchain and Bitcoin. For Bitcoin, the blockchain is just a specific type of database that actually stores every Bitcoin transaction ever made. And in the Bitcoin's case, unlike other database,
I was wondering
these
what
computers
would be the main
are not
properties
in one roof,
of blockchain,
because that wouldn't make it
especially in the
decentralized.
context of
And
Bitcoin.
each computer or group of computers all operate by the first thing that we need to know about or group of blockchain individuals is decentralization. So they all like decentralized, and that is probably one of the most important thing, personally, about geographic locations around the world. Blockchain and then to kind of keep them to be very independent from each other. So the idea behind decentralization and allow the actual blockchain technology in blockchain is like a database where through the separation of grouping, it needs a collection of computers to store its. And so these computers, the big difference between that make up the Bitcoin network. For Bitcoin, the blockchain is just a specific type of database. Through this, that actually stores every blockchain is used in a decentralized way. And in the Bitcoin case, but you also have private database centralized blockchains. These computers where basically the computers make up the network are owned by one single entity. Each computer or group of just computers all operate by a unique individual. If it's a private network, it's so they're all like one computer centralized at different periods, or two computers, but kind of together. If it's a decentralized locations around the world, computers at different to kind of keep them to be very independent from each other. In a blockchain, each node has a full record of data that has been stored on the blockchain through the separation of exception. For Bitcoin, the data is at the so these computers of all that make up the Bitcoin network. If one node has an error in its data, and through this, the others of thousands of other nodes as a reference to point to the direct. But you also have private correct centralized blockchains, where basically the computers therefore make up the network allows owned by one single entity. So just to recap transactions to actually make sense. If it's a private network, because it makes sense, and because one computer, it makes or two computers, but they're transaction If it's a decentralized, then it's multiple computers, irreversible, different geographic. And that is very, very important, because if you can change it like this, in a blockchain, each node has a full record of data. It doesn't destroy the history, but it will destroy the exception. For Bitcoin, the data is the entire history of all. And therefore, if someone is trying to, if one node has an error, try to actually tamper with record, it can use all the other nodes cross-reference points each other and pinpoint the node with the incorrect information, a node. And by pinpointing that does allows that process, that will allow the system to establish an transaction to actually make sense order of events. And because it makes sense, and because they're all together, if we use exactly the transaction of in each block, it will give you the list of the transactions. And that is very, very important, because if you can change it like this, then also other type of totally destroys the actual unification company. It doesn't destroy the history, but it will destroy the future. I know I've been talking a lot about future Bitcoin and blockchain, but I'm trying to basically and therefore, if someone is trying to show that they can both work together, to actually tamper with they can also be separated in their own process. All the other nodes would cross-reference with each other blockchain, and pinpoint the blockchain has incorrect information. There's multiple blockchains. And by pinpointing that, and so therefore, with that process, in order to change how the system allow the system to establish an exact information stored within an event, you need to have a very huge majority around the decentralized network. Use exactly the example of power, and to need to agree, it will give you the list of the transactions. And if they all agree, the blockchain, that means the majority agrees. Also, other type of legal contracts, goes certification. However, if it doesn't agree, then nothing changes. And yeah, I know I've been talking a lot about the process of blockchain, but I'm trying to basically the other type of not make it different, but show that they can both work together, accepting the actual be separated in change or not changes. Bitcoin has their own process, has its own blockchain, but blockchain has
another
there's multiple
way that
blockchains
work,
and
so
therefore, in order to change how the
decentralization,
system
we
works
also have
and the
transparency.
information stored within it, you
And
need to have
because of
a
the
very
decentralized
huge
nature
majority
of
around the
using
decentralized network.
Bitcoin again as an example.
Computing power.
So because of
and
the
to need to
decentralized
agree
nature of
on the
Bitcoin's
changes.
blockchain,
And if they
all
all agree,
transactions can be
then that means the
transparently
majority
viewed by
agrees,
either having a
therefore
personal
everything
node
should go
or
smoothly.
by using
However, if it doesn't
blockchain
agree, then
explorers. So
nothing
blockchain
changes.
explorers are pretty much like a
the
website
process of
where
how
you
blockchain
can
or
just
the
put
other
in.
type of
So every time you do a transaction, say with
cryptocurrencies
Bitcoin,
work in
you'd get like a
kind
really
of
long
accepting
string
the
of
actual
numbers and letters.
change
You know,
or
if you
not
copy and
changes
paste that into
of their
a
own process,
blockchain
basically.
explorer, you can see
So another
like where that transaction was,
blockchain
wouldn't
work
necessarily
in
know the
general.
identity. So we have decentralization,
But it allows you to
really
have,
easily see all the
transparency.
list of transactions.
So you could,
And pretty much because of the
so
decentralized
each node,
nature,
as we said earlier, has
using
a
copy of the chain,
Bitcoin again as an
that
example,
gets updated as fresh
So because
blocks
of the
are confirmed and
decentralized
added.
nature of Bitcoin's blockchain,
And what we basically mean by this
all
is
transactions
that
can
if you
be
really wanted to,
transparently
you
viewed
could by
by
either having
Bitcoin,
a personal
wherever it
node
goes,
or by
that
using
wouldn't be
blockchain
much
explorers
use to you.
So blockchain
because
explorers
the,
are pretty much like a
identity,
website where
still
you
remains
can
hidden.
just put in. So every time you do a
And
transaction,
obviously
say with
that
Bitcoin,
is
get like a
actually
really
really
long,
important because, for
string
example,
of numbers
if
and
an
letters,
exchange and
you know,
that
if you
has
copy and
happened
paste
a
that
lot
into
in a lot
a
of different
blockchain
exchanges,
explorer, you can see
if the actual
like
if those
where that
exchanges are
transaction
hacked
was,
and that
you
you
wouldn't
basically the
necessarily
people
know
that
the
had their Bitcoin
identity,
have their Bitcoin
but it
locked.
allows you to really easily see all the list of transactions.
Despite
So
the
you
hacker
could,
being anonymous,
yeah. So each
the
node, as we said
Bitcoin
earlier,
will
has
actually
a
easily
copy of the chain
traceable.
that gets
And
updated as
that
fresh
is a
blocks
very,
are
very
confirmed
good
and
thing
added.
because
And what we
Bitcoin
basically
that were
mean by
stolen
this is that if you really wanted to, you could
own,
track Bitcoin wherever
from
it
your
goes,
portfolio,
although that
and
wouldn't
that were
be
hacked,
much use to you.
if they are
because
later on
the,
moved to buy other
identity
sort of type
still
of
remains hidden.
transactions and goods and services, and it will be known.
Obviously,
So
that is
just
actually
click
really
on the
important
link
because, for example,
of the
if
transaction
an exchange and
then
that
basically
has
find where
happened
your
a lot
Bitcoin
in
has
a
been.
lot of different exchanges,
If they are obviously if the actual if those exchanges are hacked and then
another
basically
final
the
thing,
people
so
that had their Bitcoin
like key properties,
have
you've
their
got
Bitcoin locked.
decentralization, transparency. Third is
Despite
security.
the hacker being
So
anonymous,
is blockchain secure?
the Bitcoin are actually easily
So now you know
traceable.
that blockchains are an
that is
extremely
a very,
secure
very
technology.
good thing because
You know, as
the
mentioned
Bitcoin that were
previously,
stolen
it's extremely hard to
from
take
your
control of a
own,
blockchain, since
from
the
your own
hacker would
portfolio,
have to change
and that
all
were
the
hacked.
previous blocks within
If
a
they are
change.
later on moved to buy
So when you
other
introduce
sorts of
decentralized
type
blockchains
of
in the context of
transactions and
Bitcoin,
goods and services,
it becomes almost
it will be known.
impossible.
So you can
not
just
impossible,
click on the link
but it's
of the
almost
transaction,
impossible. So
and then
succeeding with
basically
such a
find where
hack
your Bitcoin has
would
been.
require the hacker
if they
to
are obviously
simultaneously control and
sent.
alter 51% copies of the blockchain.
And another final
So
thing,
that
so
their new copy
like key
becomes
properties,
a
you've got
majority,
decentralization,
and thus
transparency.
agreed upon chain.
Third is
But
security.
such an attack
So
would
is
require
blockchain
an immense
secure?
amount of money and resources.
So
And
now
since
you know
hackers would need to
that blockchains are
recalculate
extremely
all of the
secure
blocks,
technology.
because all
as mentioned
previously,
different time
it's
stamps
extremely
and hash
hard
codes,
to take
it
control
would
of
just
a
cost so
blockchain.
much money. So
Since
the hacker would have
as of
to
today,
change all the
Bitcoin has
previous
around
blocks within a change.
675,000
So when we introduce
blocks.
decentralized blockchains,
So that's how many
blocks
it becomes
almost
from the
impossible.
creation of it, how many
Not
blocks
impossible,
have been
but
created with
it's
information
almost
in.
impossible.
So succeeding with
each
such a
block
hack
proof of
would
work
require the
taking 10
hacker
minutes
to simultaneously
to change
control
all the
up to
blocks for
51%
Bitcoin's blockchain
copies of the
would
blockchain. Would take
so
about
that their new
7
copy
million
becomes
minutes,
a majority,
which calculates to
and thus
around 13 years.
agreed upon chain.
So it's not
But
an easy process.
such an
to
attack
do.
would require
and due
an
to the
immense
size of
amount of
Bitcoin's
mining
network and
resources
how fast
and
it's
since
growing,
hackers
the cost to pull
need
it
to
off
recalculate
would be
all of the blocks,
huge. And not only would it be
because all the blocks
expensive,
would have different
what's
time
really
stamps
interesting
and hash
here
codes,
is it would
just
actually
cost so much money.
The
So
reward
I
for it
think,
would almost
as
be
of today,
nothing. So you would have thought
Bitcoin has
if they
around
do pull that off,
they would
675,000
great.
blocks.
They have a 51%.
So that's how many
control of the network.
they're going to make
from
so much
the
money.
creation
of
of
it, how many
blocks
blocks have been created with
no, they
information.
probably
in.
wouldn't make much at all.
And with
if
each
not anything,
block's proof of work taking 10
and the
minutes,
reason for that is because it wouldn't
to
go
change all the
unnoticed,
blocks
as
for
Bitcoin's
network
blockchain
members
would
take
such
such
drastic
take about
alterations
7
to the
million
blockchain
minutes,
that
which
the other
calculates to around
49%
13 years.
would
So
then
it's not an
fork
easy
off
process
to
do.
create a new version of
and
the
due
chain
to the
that
size of
hasn't been
Bitcoin's
affected.
network and how fast it's growing, the
and
cost
this is
to pull it
because
off
the attack
would be
version of Bitcoin
huge and
would plummet
not
in
only would
value.
it be
So
expensive,
obviously, as we know, Bitcoin's
what's
really
interesting
easily,
here
really
is it would
easily
actually
transparent.
the reward for it
So
would almost be
if
nothing.
hackers
So
were
you
to
would have
take
thought
control of that
if they
much
do
of the
pull that
network,
off,
people
they
would
would
know.
great. They have
the other
51%
fork off
control of the network. They're
with
going
a
to make
different
so much money from all
Bitcoin
the
in that,
Bitcoins they
in
can
that
steal.
context.
And the other
they
Bitcoin
probably
value
wouldn't
would
make much at all,
if not
fall
anything,
to become worthless.
And,
So
and the
after
reason
all
for
that
that
work,
is the
because
hackers
it wouldn't go unnoticed
would,
as
network members
anything.
would see such a drastic
thing to take away
alteration
here
to the
is
blockchain.
that the Bitcoin
the
network
other 49
is built in a way
so that taking part
would
in
then
it
fork off
is far more
to create a new version of the chain that hasn't been affected.
So one final thing I mentioned,
and this is because
forking.
the
And you're probably
attack
thinking,
version
well,
of
how
Bitcoin
what's going
would
on?
plummet
How
in
can we
value.
create another?
So obviously, as we know,
Bitcoin, so
is
to
really
speak,
easily,
is easier than it
transparent.
sounds. It's essentially the
So
process
if-
of creating
if
a
hackers
copy
were to take control
of
of that
Bitcoin's
much of the
blockchain
network,
code and make
people would
changes
know.
to it.
So
The
most of the time,
49%
people would want to
fork
do that
off
in order to make
um,
improvements
with a different.
So if there was
sort
something
of
that needed to
Bitcoin
happen in that
like a
context,
small change,
and the other
it
Bitcoin
wouldn't
value
be
would
completely.
it wouldn't be a
to
great
become
idea.
worthless.
So
So
after
after
all that
anything
work,
that
the
the
hackers
it needs
would,
to have some changeability.
not have made anything.
But we have
So-
two types of
and the
forking
key
here. We
thing
have
to
the
take
soft
away
fork,
here is that
which is a
the
small
the
change,
Bitcoin network,
so that
is built in a way
is
so that
compatible
taking
with the
part
new
in it
process of the old
is far more
blockchain.
economically
So
incentivized than attacking it.
they can still work together. It's not
So one
drastic
final
enough
thing,
that
I
they
mentioned
wouldn't be
forking,
able to talk to
and you're
each
probably
other.
thinking, well, how
And sort of
what's
if you look
going
at it
on?
as
Like, how can they create
code and
another
stuff.
Bitcoin?
And then the
so
other
to
one being a
speak,
hard
but
fork,
which
which creates
forking
a totally
is
different
easier than it
blockchain
sounds. It's essentially
that has
the process
no
of creating a
relation
copy
to the
of
old
Bitcoin's
blockchain.
blockchain
So in the
code
context
and
of
making
someone
changes
hacking
to
it,
so
there would
most
most
of the
likely
time
be a
people
hard
want to
fork
do that
where a
in order to
completely
make
new version of
improvements.
that blockchain is
So if there was
created.
something that needed to
So
happen, like a small change,
you guys have probably obviously
it
heard of
wouldn't
Bitcoin,
be,
but
and it was
wouldn't be a
created by
great
Satoshi
idea if you couldn't
Nakamoto,
change anything
but this
at all.
isn't the only.
It needs to have some
Bitcoin in the game.
changeability. As
But
there
we
were
have two
other,
types
there
of
have been
forking
other
here. We have
forks
the
in the
soft
past,
fork, which is a
both
small
soft
change,
and hard.
so that
so these include
it is
Bitcoin
compatible
Cash,
with the
Bitcoin
new process
Gold,
of the old blockchain,
Bitcoin
So
Satoshi Vision.
they can still work
And these are
together.
all
It's not
alternate
drastic
with different
enough that they
characteristics
wouldn't
to
be
the
able
original
to talk to each
Bitcoin and
other.
its applied
Then sort of if
transaction
you look
fees
at it
or
as like a
decentralization
code and stuff.
And then
But
the other one being a
you
hard
could
fork,
argue that
which
they are
creates
all
a totally
trade-offs to
different
Bitcoin,
blockchain that has
and
no
especially
relation to
potentially
the
maybe some
old
of you guys out
blockchain.
there
So in the context of
wouldn't
someone
want
to
to
fall
fall
into
into
to the trap of
there
believing
would
that
most likely be a
Bitcoin
hard
Gold is
fork where a
Bitcoin and
completely
you see a
new
version
Bitcoin
of that blockchain is
Gold,
created.
so
or
Bitcoin Cash for 300.
you guys have probably
you're
obviously
getting
heard
a
of
really
Bitcoin
cheap
but,
deal on a Bitcoin,
and it was created
because
by
you're not.
Satoshi
It's a different
Nakamoto,
thing.
but this
It
isn't the only
Bitcoin, so just
Bitcoin
be
in the
aware
game.
of those.
As there were
Definitely.
there have been other forks in the past, both soft and hard.
Sounds good.
So these include
Thanks,
Bitcoin Cash,
Marco and
Bitcoin
Arthur,
Gold,
for this. Like,
Bitcoin
quite,
Satoshi Vision,
good distinction.
and these are
of
all
course, we
alternates
can
with
have
different
to recap
characteristics
as
to the
well,
original
like
Bitcoin and its
decentralization,
applied transaction
transparency, and
fees or
security.
decentralization.
And I guess like
but
you mentioned there
you
about
argue that they are all
blockchain,
trade-offs
right?
to Bitcoin.
Yeah,
And especially
being very
potentially maybe
present
some
in
of
the
you guys out there
cryptocurrency
I
arena.
wouldn't want you to fall
I was
into
wondering,
the
like,
trap of believing that
given that I also
Bitcoin
heard
gold is Bitcoin, and if you see a
blockchain being,
Bitcoin
I don't know,
gold
talked about in other
or Bitcoin
industries,
cash for
what other
£300, that you're
purposes
getting
do
a
you
really
guys
cheap
think
deal on a
blockchain might
Bitcoin,
have?
because you're not.
What types of
It's a
problems
different
do you
thing.
think
It
might
isn't
solve?
Bitcoin. So just be aware of those.
The thing with blockchain is that
definitely.
if you use the blockchain from Bitcoin, it obviously stores
Sounds good.
the data from the
Thanks,
monetary
Marco and Arthur, for
transactions
this.
and
Like,
has some sort of value behind
quite
it as
good
cryptocurrency.
distinction, and of course we can have
But blockchain
to
by
look
itself
at as well, like
has much more extensive
decentralization, transparency, and
actual
security.
value
And I guess
and
like
also
you
use
mentioned there
than
about,
just being
blockchain,
something
right?
that can be used for a transaction. It has
Being very
it is
present
very
in the
a reliable way of
cryptocurrency
storing
arena.
data.
I was wondering,
And we have a
like,
lot
given that I
of
also
different
heard
real world
blockchain being,
examples.
I don't know, talked
And we've seen a
about
lot
in
of
other
companies such as
industries.
Walmart,
What
Pfizer,
other
AEG, Siemens,
purposes do you
and
guys
Unilever
think
using
blockchain might
blockchain.
have, and
An
what
example
types of
is
problems
IBM.
do you think it might solve?
IBM has recently created. The thing with blockchain is that if you use the blockchain from Bitcoin, it obviously stores the take to get to your location. The data. So the reason behind it was because, and has some sort of value behind it. We sometimes have some issues about hygiene. But blockchain by itself you can have much more extensive of different diseases such as E. coli, value, salmonella, listeria, and other types than just being hazardous materials that can be used for a transaction. It is very a reliable way of storing past, people weren't able to actually. And we have a lot to where it went different real world. And because of that, we have examples. We had outbreaks that and we've seen a lot of companies such as Walmart, Pfizer, AEG, Siemens, and so the really using important aspect about an example is IBM. Blockchain being used here. IBM has recently created food products. It's firstly tracking the food products from its origin products through each stop it actually makes. And finally, so the reason behind it was because if you find that the food within that process issues about hygiene, you can trace back to where sometimes you can have outbreaks of and actually solve the actual issues such as E. coli, so the quicker you actually identify, the lesser you're going to get outbreaks, hazardous materials, find a solution to that. And so it's going to make the system in the past people weren't able to actually save money, save lives, and improve the PR. And because of that, we had outbreaks that actually had quite a lot of issues behind.
Sounds good. Thanks, Marco.
And so the really good,
discussing
important aspect about blockchain being used here to track
what would be the advantages
food products,
and
it's
disadvantages
firstly tracking the food products from its
and I was
origin
wondering, like, maybe
through
we can start
each stop it actually
with
makes, and
advantages
finally
with the
in the delivery.
positives.
And so if you find that the
sure
food
thing. Do you
within
wanna
that
just,
process
flick through the slide,
contaminated, you
Bogdan,
can trace
to
back
the
to
next
where
ones?
it came from and actually solve the
So,
actual issue.
for all its
And so the quicker you
complexity,
actually identify, the lesser you're going to get
blockchain's
outbreaks.
potential as a
quicker you're gonna
decentralized form
find a
of record
solution to that.
keeping is pretty
And so
much
it is
without limit.
it's going to make
So
the
as
system
as
even more
Marco's
efficient, and it's going to
mentioned,
save money,
there's so
save
many
lives,
uses that
and
we could
improve
use
the PR
blockchains for.
aspect of it.
And one of the key advantages here is, of course,
Sounds
the
good.
accuracy of the
Thanks,
chain.
Marco.
So
And
transactions on the
discussing all
blockchain
everything
network
about
are
blockchain,
approved
I
by a
think
network
it's
of
worth
thousands of
noting
computers,
what would be the advantages
as we've mentioned
and disadvantages
many times now,
of
which
blockchain.
removes almost
And I
all
was wondering,
human
like, maybe
involvement
we
in the
can start
verification
with
process.
advantages, with the
So
positives.
you're probably asking, well, why is this good? Yeah,
sure
humans
thing.
are
Do you wanna just,
renowned for
flick
making
through the
errors,
slide,
so
Bogdan,
eliminating
to
this
the next
factor
ones?
in an accurate record. So,
of-
for all
in
its
an accurate
complexity, record-keeping process, blockchain's potential
information
as a
accurate.
decentralized form
And
of
even if
record
a-
keeping
a
is pretty much
computer
without
on the
limit.
network were
So
able to make
as
a
Marco was
computational mistake,
mentioned,
the error would only
there's
be
so
made
many
on one
uses that
copy.
we
So
could
that's
use
the key thing
blockchains
here,
for.
because
And
obviously,
one
as
of
we
the key
said,
advantages here is,
you
of
have
course,
loads of
the
nodes
accuracy
all
of
around
the
the
chain.
world, which each
So
store a copy.
transactions
So
on
if
the
a mistake was
blockchain
made,
network
they'd cross-reference and
approved by a
check.
network of thousands of
So that's
computers.
the first one. It's extremely
As we've
accurate.
mentioned many
Another
times now,
huge advantage
which
is,
removes almost all human
blockchain
involvement in the
technologies,
verification
potential
process.
cost reductions.
So you're probably asking,
So
why
in
is this
the
good?
context of banks,
Well, humans are renowned for
consumers
making
pay
errors. So
a
eliminating
bank
this
to verify a
factor
transaction
in an accurate record,
or
a notary to sign a document,
in an accurate,
or even when you're getting married, a minister to perform
keeps information
a marriage.
accurate.
And blockchain,
And even if
eliminates the need for third
computer
party
on the network
verification.
were able to
That's
make
the key
a
thing to take here.
computational
It
mistake,
eliminates the need
the error
for
would only be
third-party
made on one copy.
verification.
So that's the key thing here.
And with that, obviously, as we said, comes with
you have loads of nodes
elimination
all
of
around the world,
third,
which each
of the
store a copy. So if a
associated
mistake was
costs.
made, they'd cross-reference and check.
An example
So that's
here,
the first
if we
one. It's
look at a
extremely
business
accurate.
owner who
Another
will incur,
huge advantage is
a small fee whenever they accept
blockchain
payments
technologies,
using credit cards,
potential cost reductions.
So
If we use
in the
blockchain,
context
it
of
would
banks,
eliminate the third party, which
consumers
would be
pay
the
the payment to
processing
verify a
companies.
transaction.
So it would
Or
lead to
a notary to
reduction
sign a
in costs.
document, or
And
finally,
even when you're getting married,
which
a
I won't
minister
spend too long on
perform
because obviously
a
we
marriage.
have covered this a lot.
And blockchain
again
eliminates
is the
decentralization
party
and
verification.
And that's the
Um,
key thing to take here. It
And
eliminates
that is
the need
such
for
a huge
third-party
advantage having that
verification.
decentralization.
And
So
with that,
it can't be
obviously,
attacked,
and it's very
comes
hard
with
to
an
hack.
elimination of the third
It's
associated
just
costs.
such an important thing in
So,
blockchains.
an example here,
And
if
this
we
system
look at a business
inherently makes
owner
an
who
irreversible
would incur
timeline with data.
a small fee
and
whenever
whenever
they
they
implement
implemented
payments
in
using
a
credit
centralized
cards.
nature, it's
Just
just easy to track the movement.
If we
of
use
funds.
blockchain, it would eliminate
So there's
the third party,
some
which would
key
be the
advantages
banks
in
to
the
start
start
with, the
with.
payment processing companies. Have you got any more to add, Marco?
So it would lead to
Yeah, I
reduction in
actually have
costs.
a lot.
And finally,
So the next one is
which I won't spend too long on because
the
obviously we
efficiency
have
behind
covered this a lot.
transactions.
But again,
And
is
this
the
is very
decentralization
important.
and
If you actually look at
security.
our banking system nowadays,
And that
if you
is
want to
just
send
such
money,
a huge
let's
advantage,
say
having
you want
that
to send money to your
decentralization,
grandparents
so
in another
it can't be
continent,
attacked,
or your parents,
and it's
whoever.
very hard to
It can take a
hack.
bit of time. You have to go through the whole process. There's the
It is
central
just such an
authority that has
important
to go
thing in
through the
blockchains.
KYC and all the
And you know,
process
this
and
system
checking, etc.
inherently
It takes
makes
a lot of
an
time.
irreversible timeline
And
with
so,
data.
for example, if you're sending,
And when it's
I don't know, a
implemented
check
in
or money
a
on a
centralized
Friday
nature,
evening,
it's just easy to
you
track the movement
probably
of funds.
won't get it
So there's
before
some
Monday
key
morning.
advantages to
And so
start with.
it does take a lot of time, you know.
Have you got any more
in an
to add,
economy where
Marco?
people are very fast-paced? Yeah, I actually have go quick
lot.
and be efficient. So the next one is the blockchain gives you that.
behind transactions.
Blockchain, and this
Works
is
24 hours
very
a day,
important. If you
7
actually
days a
look
week,
at our
and
banking system
365 days a
if
year.
you want to send money, and so
let's
one
say you want to
transaction
send money
can be
to
as little
your
as 10
grandparents
minutes in
in
another
another
continent,
continent,
secure after
or your
just a few
parents,
hours.
whoever,
You want to
it
work.
can take a
that.
bit of time. You have to
And
go through
while I
the
was talking about
process, there's
cross-border
the
trade,
central
authority that has
a
to go
good,
through
a very good example
KYC
was
and all the
the
process
use
and
of,
checking,
you
etc.
know, the relations
takes a lot of
between
time.
Mexico and the US.
And
A lot of
so,
people
for
want to send
example, if
money
you're sending
from the US to Mexico,
a check or money
for
on a Friday evening,
families through
you
know,
probably
some
won't
type of
get
remittances
before
and
Monday
so
morning.
they
And so
used to use
it does take a
Western
lot of
Union.
time, you know. Western Union
in an
took some
economy
time.
where people
The
are
fees
very
were
fast-paced,
obviously very
you need to
expensive.
go quick and be efficient.
Some people actually switched to
And
other type of cryptocurrencies.
blockchain gives you that,
such as blockchain,
such as
works
XRP,
24
that
hours
allow
a day,
them to
7 days a week,
be very
and
efficient with it,
365
and,
days a year.
not spend a lot of money.
And so
the
one
efficiency of the
transaction can be as
is
little as 10
probably
minutes.
one of the most
It can be
important
considered
things.
secure after just a few hours.
You
The
wanna
other
work
point I want to talk about is private
private
While I was
transactions.
talking about cross-border trade,
And we need to really understand this.
a very good example was the use
Blockchain
of
is
the relations between Mexico
how
and
to
the
say
US.
this?
A lot of people want
The
to send
thing with
money
blockchain
from
is that
the US to Mexico.
they are
families
anonymous,
through
and
some type of remittances.
they're not anonymous.
And
they're
so
confidential.
they
And that
used to
actually
use
makes
Western
big
Union.
difference.
Western Union
So,
took
for
some
example,
time. The fees were
obviously very
if, for
expensive,
example, you're trying to actually some people actually switch to
look
other
at
types of
random
random
transaction,
such as you will
such
see
as
all
XRP
the information
that allow
about
them
the
to
transaction. How much
be
money
very
was actually
efficient with
sent,
it,
and
the actual
not
like
spend a lot of money.
the
So
keys,
the efficiency
actual
of the transaction is
link of it,
probably one of the most
and so to whom it was sent,
things.
etc.
It won't
The
give you
other
the
point I want to talk
information
about
of
is
the person
private
because that's kind
transactions,
of ridiculous,
and we
but
need
it
to
will
really
show
understand
everything around this. And so that is very important.
blockchain
People
is
always talk about
how to say this.
the blockchain technology
The thing with
being very
blockchain
private,
is that
and that being true and
they
untrue
are
at the same time.
anonymous,
And I find this to be very interesting
and
because it can
they,
fight against
they're not anonymous,
other
they're
issues which
confidential.
we'll
And
be
that
talking
actually
later
makes
on.
a big difference.
The other thing
So,
is
for example,
transparency. If, for example, you're
which we'll have been
actually,
talking before,
obviously blockchain is an open source software. Anyone can
you will see all
anyone
the information
everyone
about the
can actually
transaction.
view the code,
How much money was actually
can
sent,
review the actual
the
system,
actual
look at
the
the
keys,
security
the actual
code, and
link of it,
also have a
so
look
to
at
whom
the
it
whole
was sent,
process.
etc.
The good thing about
it won't
it
give
is
you
that
the
no
information
central
of the person
authority
because that's
can
kind of
actually
ridiculous,
but it will
control the
show
Bitcoin
everything
Bitcoin code
around
the
this. And so that is very important because
how to
people
edit it,
always talk about,
but they can actually suggest
the
to
blockchain
change and upgrade the
technology
system,
being very private,
and if everyone
that
agrees, they
being
can actually
true and untrue at the same time. And I
the
find
reason
this to
why
be very
I kind of
interesting
fast
because
forward
it can
is
fight
that the last
against
one is
lots
for me
other issues, which
another very
we'll be
important
talking later
point,
on.
and that actually is
the other
quite
thing is
personal,
transparency,
is banking and
transparency,
and
which we'll have
we
been
need to
talking
know
before.
that
Obviously,
the
blockchain is
blockchain
an open source
doesn't
software.
discriminate.
Anyone can, it doesn't care
anyone
about
everyone
who you
can
are,
actually view the code,
regardless of your ethnicity, your gender, or your cultural background. Look at the security.
And we have to know that a lot of
and
people around the
also
world
have a look at the whole
and
process.
the data is actually 2
The good
billion
thing
adults
about it is that
do not have
no
bank
central
accounts.
authority
can
and
actually
so therefore they can't store
their
control the
money
Bitcoin
wealth
code,
in kind of a
Bitcoin
space,
code
or
space,
the
or
and
that happens a lot
in
in
developing countries.
but they can actually suggest
so
to change
the things that
and
happen
upgrade
is
the
that
system.
the only way for them to
agrees,
store
they can
their
actually
wealth is having a lot
the
of
reason
cash
why I
and
kind of
store
fast
it
forward is that the last one is
safe box at homes.
another
or
very
is,
important point,
and
that
actually
in
is
some safe,
quite personal,
area
is
under
banking
the
and
pillow,
health.
and that's as we
And
know it's very
we
easy
need to
actually
know
be able
that
to
the
steal that
blockchain
money. And so
doesn't
therefore there's been a lot of robbery.
it doesn't care about
unnecessary you
who you
violence,
are, by
regardless of your
creating those
ethnicity,
tasks,
your
and that
gender,
creates a lot
or
of
your
issues.
cultural background.
And therefore,
to use it.
when you have
And we have to know that a lot of
people around the world,
the
blockchain
and
technology
the data is
behind
actually
it,
2 billion adults,
and
if
if
you
you do
use
not
it
have bank
with
accounts,
Bitcoin.
you have
And so therefore they can't
Bitcoin
store
key,
their
which
money
allows
wealth in kind of a space
to go
space.
to use the Bitcoin wallet.
And And that happens
and
a lot
that can
in
be
developing countries.
stored either in a piece
And
of
so
paper,
the things that happen
chip
is
cell
that
phone,
they
even
the only way
memorize
for them
the
to
actual
store
code
their
if
wealth
necessary.
is
And so
having
that
a
allows
lot of
people
cash
to
and store
protect
it
themselves,
in this
to actually increase
safe
their wealth
box,
in their homes,
increase
or
their whole
standard living,
put in
and
some
safe
use
area
some type of
under the pillow.
progressive,
And that's, as we
value
know, it's
for the
very
world.
easy
And I
to
think that's
actually
very
be able
important
to
because
steal that money
from someone that comes
and so therefore
from
there's being a lot of
a
robbery
developing
and,
country, I
and,
think it's
and necessary violence by getting
very
those
important.
cash, and that creates a lot of issues.
No,
And therefore,
100%.
when you have
Thanks, guys, for talking
basically
about the
the
advantages.
blockchain technology
And
behind
I
it,
guess now it's
and if
it's
you use
good
it
to
with
also
Bitcoin,
talk about the
you have a
disadvantages
keys,
of
Bitcoin key,
blockchain.
which allows
Yeah,
to
sure.
to
So
use a Bitcoin wallet,
obviously, with all good things,
and that can be
there's
stored
obviously a
either in a
little bit
piece
of
of
bad things as
paper,
well.
cheap cell phone, or even
So
memorize
obviously
the
with
actual code
blockchain,
if
we got
necessary.
loads of
And
upsides
so that allows people
that we
to
both just
protect
mentioned.
themselves, to
But
actually
there's
increase
also
their wealth,
significant challenges to
increase
its
their whole
adoption.
standard
So,
living.
you know how the
and,
world
you know,
is. We
do
have something that's
some
really
type of
good,
progressive
but it generally takes a
value
while
for the world.
for it
And I
to
think
be
that's very
integrated
important
into
because
everyday
from
society
someone that
and
comes
used.
from a
So
a
the
developing country, I
roadblock to
think
the
it's
application of blockchain technology,
very
it's not
important.
just technical. The
No,
real issues here,
100%. Thanks, guys, for
unsurprisingly,
talking
are
about the
political and
advantages.
regulatory.
And I guess now it's
But
good to talk,
apart from
also
that, it's
talk about
also the thousands of hours
disadvantages
that would be
of,
required to
blockchain.
design the custom software.
Yeah,
And the
sure.
back-end
So
programming
obviously,
needed
with
to
all
integrate
good things,
blockchain
there's
with current business
obviously a little bit
networks.
of bad things as
So
well.
if you look at
So
companies
obviously
now,
with blockchain,
we got loads of upsides.
it may be obvious that yes, if they
that
were
we
to
both
put
just
in a
mentioned,
blockchain technology,
but there's also
they could,
significant
save
challenges
loads
to
of
its
costs.
adoption.
They
you know
reduce
how the world
chances
is.
of like
Have something that's
fraud,
really good, but it
but,
generally takes a
there's
while
there's a
for
big
it
startup
to be
cost.
integrated into everyday society. And
So
used.
although it can,
So blockchain,
the
can save
roadblock to
users
the application
money
of
on
blockchain,
transaction fees
technology, it's
the
not just
technology
technical.
of course
the
is
real
far from
issues
free.
here.
So the proof of work system that
Unsurprisingly,
Bitcoin
are
uses
political and
to validate
regulatory.
transactions consumes
But
vast
apart
amounts
from
of
that, it's also the
computational
thousands
power.
of hours that would be required
And this is something
to
we can touch
design
on
the
in
custom
another
software.
episode. But this
And the back-end programming needed to integrate
actually
blockchain
increases
with current
exponentially.
business networks.
So back in 2009,
if you
to,
look
to
at
mine a
companies
Bitcoin, wouldn't cost you.
that may be obvious that yes,
yeah,
if they
wouldn't
were
cost
to
you
put
much
in electricity
blockchain
usage,
technology,
they could
or
save loads of
power.
costs.
Nowadays,
the way the network's
chances
designed,
of like
internal fraud,
to get the same amount
but
of
there's a
reward for
big
mining,
startup
it would
cost.
so
Although
require
it
loads
can
more power,
blockchain
and
can
loads more
save users
computational power,
money on
So, you know,
transaction
assuming
fees,
electricity costs,
the technology
about,
of
3 to 5
is far
cents
from
per,
free.
So the proof of
kilowatt
work system
hour,
that Bitcoin uses
and then
to,
the mining
to validate
costs exclusive
transactions
of hardware expenses
consumes
it'd be about
vast amounts
$5,000
of
to $7,000
computational power.
to mine
This is something we
Bitcoin,
can touch,
which of course is
another
expensive,
episode,
but this computational power,
and that's just in the context
actually
of
increases
Bitcoin again,
exponentially.
But, so back in
Linking that
2009,
back to
the
real
mine a
world,
Bitcoin
it
wouldn't
does
cost
have
you.
its cost.
You need to
it wouldn't cost
to
you much in
pay the
electricity
fixed cost to
usage,
start it, and then also the running
or processing
costs.
power. But nowadays,
So the way the network's designed,
with the running costs,
to get the
despite,
same amount of
the
reward
cost of
for
mining
Bitcoin,
it would
users continue to drive up their electricity
require
bills
loads more power
to validate
and loads more
transactions on
computational
the
power.
blockchain.
So, you know,
assuming
when miners
electricity
add a block
costs
to
about
like
to the
3 to
Bitcoin
5 cents
blockchain,
per,
they're rewarded with enough
kilowatt
Bitcoin
hour,
to make their time
and then
energy
the mining
worthwhile.
costs exclusive
But
of hardware
when it comes to
expenses,
blockchains
it'd
that
be about
aren't
$5,000
Bitcoin,
to
so say if we wanted to use
$7,000
it as
to mine a coin,
just
which
a
of
secure
course
store of
is
information.
expensive.
And that's just in the context of Bitcoin
with,
again.
like,
But
with
other than
if you want to
linking
use
that
it
back
for
to
the
secure
real
use
world,
of,
it does have its
without
cost. You need
cryptocurrencies,
to,
miners would need to be paid, or
pay the
otherwise
fixed cost to start
incentivized
it, and then
to
also
validate
the running
their
costs.
transactions. So that's what I'm
So,
trying to get at here. With cryptos, you have
with the running costs,
incentive,
despite
but
the cost of
mining
mining
Bitcoin,
Bitcoin,
you don't necessarily have
drive
that
up their
incentive
electricity
there.
bills in order to
validate transactions.
And Marco, if you
on
got
the
anything to
blockchain.
add. And that's because
go
when
for it.
miners add a block to,
Yeah,
to the
there are
Bitcoin
some other
blockchain,
issues, and one
they're
of them is
rewarded with
obviously
enough
the
Bitcoin
speed
to make their
efficiency.
time and energy
And
worthwhile.
Bitcoin is
But
obviously
when
the
it comes to
perfect case
blockchains
study
that
of
aren't
the
Bitcoin, so say if we wanted to
inefficiency
use it
of
as
blockchain.
a
So as we
secure
said,
store of
the
information,
Bitcoin proof of work system
um,
takes about 10 minutes to add a
with
new
like
blocks to the
with
blockchain.
other than if you want to use
However,
it
at that
for
rate, it's
a secure
estimated that the
use of
blockchain network can only manage
without
about 7
cryptocurrencies,
transactions
miners
per
would need to be
second.
paid or
And
otherwise
that is
incentivized
very,
to
very,
validate
very
their
low
transactions. So that's what
compared
I'm trying to
to a
get at
legacy
here.
brand Visa,
With
for example,
cryptos,
that
you
uses
have the
2400,
incentive,
24
but
1,000
with non-crypto,
TPS,
you
which
don't
is
necessarily
transaction
have
per
that
second.
incentive there.
Obviously, we have other
Marco, if
cryptocurrencies
you've got
that were
anything to
able
add,
to actually do the
go
transaction
for it.
quicker. Yeah, there
especially Ethereum,
there are
which
some
we'll
other
be talking
issues
about
a bit
later.
later.
One of them is all
But for
obviously
Bitcoin,
speed inefficiency.
that's obviously one of the big issues
And
behind it.
Bitcoin is
Especially when a lot
obviously
of
the
people are actually
perfect
mining.
case study of
It's
inefficiency.
it's an issue
of blockchain.
of blockchain. So as we said, the
However,
Bitcoin
I think that
proof
in
of
the
work
future,
system, and that's a good
takes
thing,
about
such as
10
the
minutes to
example
add
when you
Ethereum
blocks to blockchain.
and with the development of it.
However, at that
that's
rate,
just
it's
blockchains
estimated that
in
the blockchain
general
network can only
is that
manage
we'll be
about
maybe
7
able to
transactions
have
per
3,000
second.
transactions per second.
And that is
The
very,
challenge.
very, very low compared to
Another
legacy
issue
brand Visa,
with
for example, that
Bitcoin
use
is obviously the illegal
2,400,
activities.
24
something that we obviously
1,000
need to talk about,
TPS, which
and
is
that the
transactions per
media
second.
likes to talk.
Obviously, we
about
have
a
other
lot.
cryptocurrencies that
obviously
were able
with
to actually do the
confidentiality
quicker
on the blockchain
such as
network
Ethereum,
that protect
which
users
we'll be
from
talking a bit
hacks
later,
and preserve
but
its
for Bitcoin,
privacy. That's
people
obviously
are,
one of the big
it will
issues
allow
behind it,
illegal
especially when a
trading
lot of people actually
and
mining.
activity on the blockchain network.
It's
one of
an issue.
most known example is
Um,
Silk Road. So
However,
Silk
I
Road
think
was
that in the
actually
future,
an online
and that's a good
dark
thing,
web,
such as the example of
marketplace,
Ethereum,
on weapons kind of
and with
place
the development of it,
operated
and that's just
from
in
February
blockchain
2011
in
to
general,
October 2013.
is that
That
will
was
be maybe
shut down
able
by
to
the
have
FBI
3,000
because
transactions per second.
it had a lot of
later
those
on in life.
activities, and the currency
Another
that was
issue with
so that was the
Bitcoin
first
is
time that
obviously the
people
illegal
actually
activities,
learned about Bitcoin,
something that we
which is
obviously
not really
need to
really
talk
good
about,
when,
and
that the
when
media
you
likes to
have
talk
such an
about
infant
a
kind of
lot.
technology.
And obviously,
The
with
last point that is an issue is
confidentiality
regulations.
on the blockchain network.
And so
protect users
regulation is
from
always
hacks
something
and
that preserve its
the
privacy.
space likes to talk about. People are,
Especially
it will allow
about
the
illegal
government
trading
regulations
and
about
activity on the blockchain
cryptocurrencies.
network.
And
one of the
despite
most known
the
example is
very
Silk Road. So
impossibility
Silk Road was actually an
of
online
ending
dark web drug marketplace,
Bitcoin
on
and
weapons
all the
kind of
decentralized
place
network
that operated
blockchain.
from February 2011 to October 2013.
the government trying to
Shut down by
ban
the FBI because
cryptocurrencies
it had a lot of those
is
activities, and
is
the
actually possible.
currency
And a
that
lot
was
of
actually
countries
used
have
actually
Bitcoin.
do so.
And so that was the
For
first time
example,
that
China
people
has do
actually
so.
learned
You know,
about
this
Bitcoin,
which is not really
they
good
have a lot of illegal
when,
activities over there.
when
You
you
have
have
mining.
such an infant
You obviously
kind of
have
technology.
India that have done so.
The last point
That
and
is
I
an
think
issue is
some other
regulation.
African countries.
And so
regulation is
obviously
always
that could
something
be an
that
issue for
the
cryptocurrencies.
space likes to
But
talk about,
that also could be a good thing,
especially
which
about the
I'll be
government
talking a little
regulations
bit
about
later.
cryptocurrencies.
And
No, sounds good.
despite the
Like you said, Marco,
very
whenever
impossibility
people think about
of
Bitcoin, or
ending
whenever I was thinking
Bitcoin
about
and
Bitcoin,
all the
I was
decentralized
imagining
network
this
and
currency
blockchain,
that's like
the
illegal people use
government
to
trying to
exchange
ban
services and
cryptocurrencies
stuff like that on the deep web.
is
But now it's
actually possible,
definitely
and a lot of countries
much more
have actually
interesting,
do
much
so.
more
For
mainstream.
example, China has do so.
Given that
You know,
the
there's
retail traders have access to it,
they
as
have a lot
well
of illegal
as
activities over
hedge
there
funds and
with
Elon
mining.
Musk,
You obviously have
the
India
techno king.
have done so,
And now,
and I think
talking
some other
about
African countries.
Bitcoin this time,
And
going
so
from
obviously that
blockchain,
could be an issue
what
for
the
cryptocurrency,
advantages
but
of
that
Bitcoin
also
would
could be
be?
a good
And
thing,
then
which
maybe we can
I'll
talk
be
also
talking a little
about
bit
the
later.
disadvantages. No, sounds good.
So
Like you said,
Bitcoin,
Marco, whenever people
big
think
advantage,
about
although
Bitcoin, or
this is
whenever I was
comparing
thinking
Bitcoin
about
to money.
Bitcoin, I
A
was
big
imagining
advantage of it
this
is
currency
application.
that's
Of course,
like
when we get onto other
illegal people
cryptocurrencies in
use
general,
to exchange
which have more
services
application
and
than
stuff like that
Bitcoin,
on
some
the
would
deep
argue
web.
that Bitcoin's
But
application
now
is quite
it's
limited.
definitely
But,
much more
comparing it
interesting,
to the
much more
context of
mainstream.
having instead of a
Given that
£10
all the
note,
retail traders have
Bitcoin
access to it, as
has a
well
lot more
as hedge
application.
funds and Elon Musk,
So it's a financial instrument.
the techno king.
So nowadays,
And
it's just getting more and
now,
more complicated.
talking
You can buy
about
futures
Bitcoin this
of
time, going from blockchain,
and derivatives of
what the
Bitcoin.
advantages of Bitcoin
It's also a
would
method
be,
of
and then
investment.
maybe we can talk
Of
also
course,
about
it's your
the
standard medium of
disadvantages.
exchange, unit of account, store of value, which was some of the things we mentioned earlier on. A big advantage, although. But another big advantage Bitcoin to money, freedom and payment. Advantage of it is application. So, like Marco was saying, when we get onto other with regards to blockchain in general, about which have more application than Bitcoin, some would argue that or if, say if I wanted to send money to Marco now, comparing it to the context of I might be charged with a £10 note bank fee, Bitcoin something. Has a lot more application. Bitcoin, so it's a set fee for however. So nowadays, Bitcoin is just getting more and more complicated, and you can send it anywhere globally, anytime without restrictions. And derivatives of Bitcoin, that's a really big bonus. It's if also I wanted to send money abroad, investment a lot easier to. Of course, it's your standard medium of exchange. Like blockchain, it's unit of account, store really value, transparent. Which was some of the things we mentioned earlier on. Transactions are secured and presented on the blockchain. But another big advantage again, is allowing anyone to verify freedom and payments, the validity of them. Like Marco was saying, again, we also have privacy with regards to blockchain. So personal information isn't displayed in certain countries. You don't have access. But again, the possibility of fraud, say if I wanted to send money to Marco now is eliminated. Hong Kong, so it's sort of I might be charged with private bank fee, like Marco or something. But with and finally, Bitcoin, we have low transaction. It's a set fee for however, which is similar to Bitcoin being able to send, and you can send it anywhere globally, anytime. But just more generally, even if you were within a country, if I wanted to say, really big bonus. If I wanted to send money abroad, it'd be a lot easier to or SWIFT system.
Again, like blockchain,
I would be hit with higher
really
fees
transparent
than I would if I were
so
to
all
use Bitcoin.
transactions are secured and presented on the blockchain.
So if you want to talk
Again,
about
allowing
the
anyone to
disadvantages,
verify
Marco, the validity of
Yeah,
them.
for sure. So for
Again, we also have
the
privacy.
disadvantages of
So
Bitcoin,
personal information
one of the
isn't
big things that
displayed,
people actually talk about is volatility.
but again, the possibility
And
of fraud,
the
on payments or
volatility
thefts
is
in
what I
Bitcoin
call
is
another day
eliminated.
in the office. You
So
know,
it's sort of
Bitcoin
like
is traded
it's
24/7.
private, but it's not like
You're
Marco
gonna
was
see
saying.
like 20, 30, 40% down
Finally,
within 24
we have low
hours,
transaction
and that's
fees,
just a normal day.
which
And
is
so
similar
the
to being able
uncertainty
to
from
with
volatility
the freedom
creates
of payments point.
created
But just
from the
more
constant
generally,
trading
even if you were
Bitcoin
within a country, if I
effects
wanted to
is
say
always affected
send
by
money
different kind of
on
events.
PayPal, West,
So it's
or
very,
Western
very hard to
Union,
actually do so.
or SWIFT system.
And so, and that will come back
I would
later
be
to
hit
the
with
lack
higher
of knowledge
fees than I
is an
than I
issue
would
because
if
you
I
always
were to
need
use
to
Bitcoin.
understand the market before trading. Which
So if
how
you
it
want to
makes
talk about
sense.
the disadvantages,
The second thing is no
Marco,
chargeback options. That means
Yeah,
that
for sure,
as
for
soon
sure.
as you
So
actually
for the
execute
disadvantages
an
of
order,
Bitcoin,
one of the big
exchange
things that people actually
transaction,
talk about is
whatever,
volatility.
there's no option
And
to actually
the
cancel
volatility
the
is
transaction.
what I call another day in
It's
the
gonna
office.
be,
You know,
you do it,
Bitcoin
it's
is
your
traded
decision.
24/7. You can't come back.
And so
you're
that
gonna
could be an
see
issue
like
if
20, 30, 40% down within 24 hours.
a wrong address,
and that's just
etc.,
a normal
etc.
day. And
that
so the
does
uncertainty
contribute
from
to
volatility
decrease
creates
the supply of
created
Bitcoin,
from the constant
which
trading
I've
Bitcoin
talked
effects
before.
is always affected by
The third
different
one,
kind
which
of
I just
events.
mentioned,
So it's
is a
very,
lack
very
of
hard
knowledge.
to actually do so.
And so that
And so
often leads
and that
to your loss of
will
private
come back
keys
later
due
to the
lack of
password.
knowledge.
You forgetting
Is
the
an issue
password because you always need
what
to
the actual
understand
process
the
behind
market before
a
trading,
private key
which
is,
how it gets to make
and
sense.
also the lack of
The
knowledge
second
of
thing is
coins.
no
And
chargeback
so
options. That means that
that
as soon
obviously
as you
doesn't
actually
just talk about Bitcoin, but also
execute
talks about
an
the whole
order,
cryptocurrency in general.
an exchange,
You
know the technology behind
whatever.
the different technologies behind.
There's no option to
different
actually
cryptocurrencies.
cancel
You need to
the
know how to
transaction.
trade. You need to know the volatility behind it.
You do it,
And
it's your
that is
decision.
why sometimes you have a lot
so
of
that could be
issues
an
around
issue
pump
if,
and dumps. You know, where people
you
actually
don't actually
put
know what's happening.
a wrong address,
The fourth one is
etc.,
difficulty to work
and
with merchants.
that
For
does
example, if
contribute
you're
to
trying
the
to buy
decrease
goods and
supply
services,
of Bitcoin,
most of the time it's
which
going to be in the
I've
retail
talked,
world. Was a Bitcoin.
The third one,
It's
which
gonna
I
be very,
just very
mentioned,
difficult,
is a lack of knowledge.
do so
And so
with
that
some cards,
obviously
but
often leads
they're
to
going
a
to charge a lot of
keys
fees behind
with
it,
the password.
and so it's going to
You're forgetting the password.
just to buy a good or service,
the
the
actual
actual cost you
process
more
of having
money than if
a
you actually
private
just
key
use
is.
cash. And
Also, the lack
another
of
one
knowledge
is the
of
average
coins.
transaction.
So
Time
that
has
obviously
risen on a certain
doesn't just
occasions,
talk about Bitcoin,
which
but
is
also
one of the
talks
points
about the
that
whole
I talked
cryptocurrency in
on
general,
the blockchain.
You need to know the technology behind
with time, with more
technology
transactions, with different cryptocurrencies, you need to know how to trade.
It's going to
You
be
need to know the volatility behind it.
We actually hope.
And that is why
the last
sometimes
one
you
is
have
no
a lot of issues
provision
around
of
pump and
credit
dumps,
nor
where
rewards
people don't actually know
programs.
what's happening. The good thing now is that these days, for example, if
had a
you're
company
trying
called
to buy goods and services,
it has a
most of the time it's going to be in the
card.
retail
Well,
world.
actually,
Was a lot of different
was a
credit
Bitcoin.
cards.
It's going to be very,
So
very
basically, you
difficult.
can use this credit
You
card
can
to actually
do
buy
so
whatever
with
you
some
want.
cards, but
all you need to
they're
do
going to
is
charge a lot of fees behind
basically
it. And
pledge
so it's going to
a Bitcoin
you know,
or
just to buy a good
cryptocurrencies as
service,
a
it's going to
collateral
cost you more
in your
money
account
than if you actually
so you
just
can
use
just
cash.
go buy whatever you want.
Another
so
one
that
is the
can be
average
very
transaction.
interesting. It gives you reward.
Time has risen on
Programs
certain
on
occasions,
Netflix, on
which
Amazon,
is one of the
etc.
points that I
And so I think that's
the blockchain.
basically the future
Of blockchain
with
and
time,
Bitcoin,
with more
which we'll be
transactions,
talking
with
later on.
and more mining, it's going to be increasing.
Sounds
And
very
we actually
interesting,
hope that it will. So
guys.
the last
And
one is no
you mentioned there about
provision of
future
credit nor
applications,
rewards
future
programs.
uses of
The good thing
blockchain,
now is
Bitcoin.
that
I
these
was wondering,
days
could you
we've had
expand
a
on
company
that?
called Crypto.com.
Yeah,
It
so
has a
we are
card,
in
or actually
very early
lots of
days, you
different
know.
credit
So
cards.
from its
And so basically,
initial
you can use this
invention
credit
as a
card to actually
research
buy whatever
project
you
all the way
want.
back in
All you need to do
1991,
is
you know,
basically
blockchain is
pledge
comfortably
a
settling
Bitcoin
into
or
its
other
late 20s.
cryptocurrencies as a
And like
collateral
most
in your account.
millennials its age,
And so you can just go
blockchain
buy
has seen
whatever
its
you
fair
want. And
share
so
of
that could
public
be very
scrutiny
interesting. It gives you
over the
reward
last 2 decades,
programs, I think, on
with
Netflix,
businesses
on
around the
Amazon,
world
etc.
speculating
And
about
so I think that's
what the
basically the
technology
future
is
of
capable
blockchain
of,
and Bitcoin, which
and
we'll
where
be
it's heading in
talking
the years to
later.
come. But with many practical
Sounds very
applications for the
interesting,
technology
guys.
already
And
being
you
implemented
mentioned there about the
and
future
explored, you know,
applications,
blockchain is
future
finally
uses
making a name for itself
of
at age
blockchain and Bitcoin.
27.
I was wondering, could
and
you
in no
expand
small
on that?
part because of Bitcoin. Yeah, so we
I'll
are
just
in
quickly talk
very
about
early
one
days, you know,
future use
so
here.
from its
So
initial
in
invention
the years
as a
to come, we
research
could see
project all the way
blockchain
back
used
in
within
1991.
healthcare.
You know, blockchain
this
is
is a really
comfortably
interesting
settling into
concept.
its
So
late 20s. is essentially,
And
imagine
like
most millennials, it's
how
age,
sort of
blockchain is
the
seen
NHS,
fair share
how
of public scrutiny,
inefficient they are
over the
as
last
much
2
as I do love
decades,
the NHS,
with businesses
with
around the
regards
world
to
speculating
getting
about
documents on time,
what the technology is
or if you
capable
have
of,
a different GP
and
somewhere
where
else
it's heading in the
in a
years to
different
come.
surgeon,
but with many practical applications to get the technology, patient information being implemented, it can be quite hassling process. Blockchain is finally making a lot of time for age 27. Healthcare providers like the NHS and in no small part leverage blockchains to securely store their patients' medical records. I'll just quickly talk about one providing patients with the proof and confidence. So in the years to come, we could see blockchain used within healthcare. It'd be a really efficient way. So this is a really interesting concept. From private healthcare to essentially, imagine even if you say how sort of in France or the NHS, how injury inefficient they are. As much as I do love the NHS, about what happened with regards added on to getting one document on time. So your string of medical history, if you have a different GP somewhere else, easily surgeon, and it's such sometimes such an interesting way to get the patient information. Do you have any other future uses? You think it can be quite hassling process?
Another one is basically facilitating
healthcare providers like the NHS were to
general elections
leverage
to more casual
blockchains
elections
to
within,
securely store their patients' medical records.
Different companies.
Providing patients with the proof.
This would actually make it impossible to
it'd be a really
temper
efficient
the
way.
actual
So
votes and providing the officials
from
nearly
private
instant
healthcare to public
results.
healthcare.
And so obviously,
Even if you
with the
were,
recent elections in
in
the US,
France
we
or
wouldn't
Hong
have
Kong, and you had
what
an
has
injury,
happened
and there
in
was
the last US elections.
record about what
Another
happened.
usage
It will be
is
added onto
for
your
any
one
types of
blockchain.
for countries
So
or
your
areas
string of
where
medical
there's a
history would
little
be,
to
so
non-governmental financial
easily
structures,
viewable, and it's
or what we
such
call and
such an
no
interesting way.
recorder's office.
But Marco, do you have any other future
in those
uses,
areas,
you think?
it's pretty much impossible. Another one is
the property.
basically facilitating.
And so we talk right here about
system,
the recognition
from, general
of
elections
property
to
rights.
more casual elections.
And so the
different
people in those
societies
areas can actually use
different companies.
blockchain as
This would
leverage
actually make
to be able to
impossible
show a
temper
transparent
the
and
actual
clear
votes
timeline of
and providing the
how
officials
the property
nearly
when was the
results.
property was bought,
And so obviously, with the recent
when
elections
was
in
the
the US,
property was
we
bought,
wouldn't have
who was it
what has
buying
happened
from, etc.,
in the
etc.
last US
creating
elections.
a clear timeline of the property,
Another usage is
ownership,
for
and that
any
would
types of war for
gladly
countries or
increase
areas
the,
where there's
the
a
whole
little
administrative
to
purposes
non-governmental
of,
financial structures,
that area,
or what
that
we
could
call
also work for
and no
developing
recorder's
countries than
office.
just developed.
Where in those areas,
Lastly,
it's
and
pretty much
that is
impossible
that is a topic
prove
that I'm
the
very
ownership
excited
of
about
the
is the
property.
future impact.
And so we
of
talk right
blockchain,
here
and
about
we can also talk
the recognition
about
of
Bitcoin
property rights
on
AI. And so
IoT,
the people in those
Internet of
areas
Things,
can actually
distributed
use
ledger technology, big data,
blockchain
robotics,
as
and machine
a
learning
leverage
to be able to
all these will go into
show
the
a transparent
concept
and
clear
clear
timeline
timeline
of
how the property when was the property
with
was
no
bought,
sign of point of failure,
when was the property was bought,
disintermediation,
who was it buying from, etc., etc.
alterable,
Creating a
and
clear
being
timeline
able
of
to
the property
ownership,
have
and that would
record of events
gladly
searchable
increase
and
the whole
classifiable.
administrative purposes.
So making it,
of
as I've
that
said
area.
previously,
That
much
could
more
also work
efficient
for
developing
for
countries than
Bitcoin.
just developed.
We'll have what we call digital currencies and
Lastly,
tokenization
and
of custom
that is
financial
a topic
instruments.
that I'm very excited about is the future
kind of go
impact
into the
of
exchanges.
blockchain, and we can also
And the
talk
combination with
about
AI
Bitcoin
and IoT
on
will
AI,
create a new world
IoT,
of
so Internet of
autonomous
Things,
distributed
system
ledger interacting with each other through systems such as smart
robotics,
contracts
and machine
We'll
learning.
be talking later on with
All
Ethereum. All
these
these will go
and
into the
basically
concept
procuring
of
the servers
decentralized governance
from each other and
which
transactions.
will be coupled
The
with no sign
DeFi,
of
which is something
point
that
of
a lot
failure,
of people have been hearing about, which is decentralized finance and exchanges will further its development.
alterable.
Those issues are very
being
cool.
able to,
We'll obviously talk
to
about
have
it later on.
the record of
And one of
events
the and all of
searchable
this
and
goes into the
classifiable.
concept
So making
of
it,
decentralized,
as I've
autonomous
said previously,
organizations,
much more efficient.
called DAOs.
For
which we will also
Bitcoin,
be talking
we'll have what we
later
call
on.
digital currencies
And
and
so,
tokenization of
I
custom
guess
financial
that would
instruments.
be
So even
the
more
end of
options
this
to
part.
actually kind of go into the
Thank you very
exchanges.
much, Marker.
And the
Arthur,
condition with
seems
AI
like
and
we
IoT
covered quite a
will
lot
create a new world
in our
of
first
autonomous
episode, but I'm super
system
excited
interacting
for
with each
all the
other through
information that
systems such as smart
we
contracts,
discussed.
which we'll be talking
I'm
later
sure
on with
definitely
Ethereum.
in the next
And
episodes we will
basically
be
procuring the
discussing more
servers
about
from each other
Bitcoin,
and settling
more about
transactions.
how to choose your cryptocurrency,
The DeFi,
how
which is
to
something that a
invest
lot
in
of people have been
as
hearing
well
about, which
as
is
other
decentralized
future
finance and
applications
exchanges will
of
further its development.
Bitcoin.
Those
But
issues
yeah,
are very cool.
thank you very much
We'll
for
obviously talk
listening,
about it later on.
and yeah,
And
stay
one of the
tuned
and
for
all
our
of this
next
goes into the
episodes exclusively
concept of
on
decentralized
Lifestone
autonomous
Insights.
organizations.
Yeah, thank you
called
guys.
DAOs,
We've got loads of
which we will
projects
also
we're
be
going to talk
talking
about
later on. And so
yeah,
we're really
I
excited.
guess
It's
that will
be
it's
the
a
end
new
of this
industry.
part.
There's a lot of very exciting
Thank you very
projects.
much, Marker.
and things happening.
Arthur, seems
And
like
we
we
guess that,
covered
we
quite a
want to
lot
talk about it.
in our first episode,
Sweet.
but I'm
Thanks,
super
guys.
excited for all the information
Thank
that we
Yeah.
we discussed. Sure, definitely in the next episodes
Oh,
we will be discussing more about Bitcoin,
Woo-woo.
more about how to choose your our first episode,
dude.
how to invest in it, as
That was
well
decent.
as other future applications
Fuck.
of Bitcoin.
Dude,
But yeah,
oh my god.
Thank you very
There's
much for listening, and yeah, stay tuned for our next episodes exclusively on Lifestone Insights.
Yeah, thank you guys. We've got loads of projects we're going to talk about.
We're really excited. It's it's a new industry. There's a lot of very exciting projects and things happening, and we guess that we really want to talk about it.
Sweet. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Right. So
Cheers.
yeah. How can you find it?
Oh,
And cut.
woo woo!
Woo-hoo-hoo! Our first episode.
Dude.
Excited for you guys.
That was decent.
Oh, fuck. Dude, oh my God. There's some